Today, I'm going to take you on a journey through a relationship that was anything but easy, a love story that pushed boundaries and tested every part of the heart. It starts with a man who is deeply in love with a woman who lives far away. Every time they meet, it's as if he's climbing a mountain just to be with her. Their love isn't the fairy tale you expect. It's intense, it's overwhelming, and it takes everything out of him. When they're together, it's pure bliss. But when she's gone, he's left struggling to recover, trying to find peace in the chaos she leaves behind. And yet, despite the emotional toll, he can't walk away. There's something about her that he can't let go. At the same time, he's working on something deeply personal, a novel that explores the darkness of trauma, the kind of affection that comes with pain, and how love can sometimes look more like a wound than a cure. As he writes, he's forced to confront his own feelings, his fears, and the harsh reality of what he's going through. But as the story unfolds, everything starts to unravel. The more he writes, the more the lines between his real life and his fiction blur. And soon he's faced with a decision. Does he keep fighting for a love that might be breaking him? Or does he let go and face the truth that he's been running from? The story is only just beginning, and the questions it raises could change everything. Stay tuned. Every time he left her, he felt like he was stepping into a storm. The feeling would settle in as soon as the door closed behind him, as if he had left part of himself back in her apartment. She lived hours away, and yet every time he made the journey back home, it felt like a journey into himself. Her intense presence had a way of suffocating him, pulling him deeper into his emotions, until all he wanted to do was curl up and sleep for days, trying to forget what it felt like to be that vulnerable, that exposed. It wasn't that she didn't love him. It was that she loved him in ways that were far too much, far too intense. She didn't let him be anything less than what she needed, and sometimes he wasn't sure if he could keep up. There were days when they would talk for hours, only for her to snap at him over something small, something insignificant, and those small things would linger, growing in his mind long after he had left her, leaving him unsure of where the relationship ended and where his own identity began. Her criticisms hurt, but they were also a part of the pull he felt toward her. There were moments when she would be cold, distant, and then suddenly warm, drawing him in with the smallest gesture, a look, a touch. He never knew what to expect, and that unpredictability kept him tethered to her, like a moth to a flame, even as he knew he was getting burned. And yet, in between those moments of frustration, there was love, the kind that made him forget everything else, the kind that made him feel alive, even when it hurt. But as he walked away from her apartment yet again, with the weight of their latest argument fresh on his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if the love was enough to keep them both from falling apart. The bus ride back home was always the hardest part. He stared out the window, his reflection merging with the passing scenery, a blur of lights and shadows. He hated the distance, not just the physical miles, but the emotional ones too. Every time he left her, there was a part of him that stayed behind. She was always there in his thoughts, like an echo he couldn't shake. And yet, when they were together, it was as if the world outside didn't exist. But the moment he stepped away, reality came rushing back, heavy, suffocating. His mind drifted to the latest argument they had. It had been small, something insignificant, but with her, even the smallest thing could spark a fire. She'd criticized his writing again, tearing apart the pages of his novel, Happy Baby. It stung more than he cared to admit. She didn't understand the depth of it, the pain he was trying to express, the darkness he had poured into the story. She never did. She couldn't see past her own expectations. And that was the real problem. She wanted him to be someone else, to be lighter, to write something they could laugh about. But he was never that person. Not with her, not with anyone. He found himself wondering if she even understood him at all. There were moments when it felt like they were speaking two different languages, their connection fraying at the edges. He tried to explain the truth of his book, the complexity of the emotions behind it, but she just didn't get it. Her love, so intense and all-consuming, felt like a constant pressure. It was like being trapped in a room that was both warm and suffocating. And yet, when she smiled at him, when they were together in those fleeting moments of peace, all the doubts faded. But the weight of the tension always lingered, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was the love or the pain that kept them locked in this cycle. The tension was unbearable, and it was building inside him, like a pressure that wouldn't stop rising. As the bus rolled closer to his stop, he could feel his chest tightening, his thoughts circling back to her, to them. It was always the same pattern. Days of bliss followed by a slow unraveling. They had barely spoken since the argument, her words echoing in his head. "You don't get it. Your book, your life, it's all too dark." And every time he told himself it didn't matter, but deep down it did. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, the cold of the bus station seeping into his skin. It was early morning, and the streets of the city were quiet, empty, like everything was holding its breath. He stepped off the bus, his feet heavy on the pavement, his mind filled with questions. Was it his fault? Could he have been someone else? Someone who didn't have to drown in his own darkness? Someone who could laugh with her, share the simple things? But that wasn't him, and he had come to accept that, even though it made him feel hollow inside. Walking back to his apartment, he couldn't help but notice how empty everything seemed. The streets he once knew so well felt foreign, the cityscape now just a backdrop for his restless thoughts. The weight of the situation gnawed at him, a gnawing that wouldn't let go. Was he supposed to stay with her and keep fighting for a love that felt like it was slipping through his fingers? Or was it time to walk away? He reached his door, but the moment he stood there, hand on the knob, everything froze. Something was off. The silence around him felt too thick. The air itself felt charged, as if someone, was waiting just beyond the door. He hesitated, unsure if he was ready for whatever came next. Whatever this moment was, it was going to change everything. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in front of the door. Something didn't feel right. There was a sudden shift in the air, an unsettling stillness that made his skin crawl. For a split second, he thought he heard a faint noise coming from inside, like a muffled voice. But that couldn't be possible. He was certain he'd locked the door when he left. His hand lingered on the knob, the uncertainty clawing at him. Taking a deep breath, he turned it slowly and stepped inside. The apartment was eerily quiet, darker than usual, as though the shadows had thickened in his absence. His gaze darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. Nothing. But the sense of something wrong was too overwhelming to ignore. He moved toward the kitchen, his footsteps light, almost hesitant. And then he saw it. There on the counter, her phone. It was impossible. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not after the way things ended. She'd left days ago, said she needed space. But there it was, a reminder of her lingering presence. It felt like a bad omen, a symbol of unfinished business, of a relationship that couldn't let go. His pulse quickened as he reached for the phone, the screen glowing with a new notification. Hesitant, he unlocked it, the message sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't from her, it was from someone else. Someone he didn't recognize, with a simple, unsettling message. "You're not the only one in this." His breath caught in his throat, confusion mixing with a growing dread. The ground seemed to shift beneath him as he stared at the screen, trying to piece together what this meant. Who was this person? What were they trying to say? And more importantly, how long had this been going on? The weight of the unknown pressed in, and his stomach dropped. The quiet he had felt earlier was now replaced with the haunting realization that the story, his story, was far from over. His heart raced, a mix of adrenaline and disbelief coursing through him as he stared at the phone in his hand. The message was clear, but the weight of it didn't fully hit him until the last words. "You're not the only one in this." Panic bubbled up inside him. Who was this? What was their connection to her? His mind reeled and his thoughts were a blur as he felt the walls of his reality starting to close in. Every step he had taken to understand her, to figure out where they stood, now seemed meaningless. This wasn't just about their relationship anymore. There were more layers to the story. Dark, uncharted territory. He threw the phone onto the counter, frustration boiling over as he tried to make sense of it. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. She had left without explanation, without warning. Every time they spoke, there was a coldness in her voice, a distance that had grown in ways he couldn't pinpoint. He had blamed himself, thinking it was his fault, but now it was clear. There were secrets she hadn't shared, parts of her life that had been hidden. Suddenly, a sound broke his trance, a soft knock at the door. His breath caught. Could it be her? His mind screamed to open it, but he hesitated. He wasn't ready for whatever confrontation was waiting for him on the other side. He stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before finally making up his mind. He swung the door open. But it wasn't her. It was someone he never expected, a familiar face from his past. His old friend Jake stood there, an unreadable expression on his face. Jake didn't say anything at first, just watched him carefully. Then with a grave tone he spoke. She never left. You need to know the truth, about everything. His world tilted as the truth began to unravel. The pieces were all falling into place, but the final twist was something he never could have predicted. It wasn't just about love, loss, or betrayal. It was something much darker. Jake stepped inside, his expression heavy with something unspoken. As he sat down across from him, he sighed, clearly struggling with the weight of his words. I know you're confused. I know you're angry, Jake began, but this isn't just about her. It's about all of us. The words hit him like a blow to the chest and he leaned forward, trying to process the gravity of it all. Jake explained how his friend had been caught in a web of lies, not just with him, but with others too. Her life, it turned out, was riddled with secrets, and those secrets were beginning to surface in ways neither of them had ever imagined. She's been hiding something from everyone, even from herself. It's a bigger mess than you can possibly understand. Jake's eyes were filled with concern, but there was something else there too, an unsettling mix of guilt and fear. The truth was far from what he had anticipated. His whole life with her, the passion, the confusion, everything, had been part of a much darker picture. Suddenly, everything made sense, and yet it didn't. The realization that the love he thought he had was built on an illusion crushed him, but it also freed him. There was nothing left to hold on to. The pieces of his life with her shattered, leaving him with a profound clarity that he had been avoiding for so long. As Jake left, offering no further explanation, the protagonist stood alone in his apartment, the weight of everything heavy on his chest. His journey of love, loss, and dark stories had come to an end, but the lessons learned about the fragility of trust, the consequences of secrets, and the complexities of human emotions remained with him. In the silence, he finally understood that sometimes the hardest thing to let go of is not the love, but the lie we've told ourselves about it.